Rise of Hawk, Part 4, Scene 20. There were no street lamps in the area where Zack and Barna walked, so it was dark. Abandoned buildings towered over them, and there seemed to be no one else around. Zack forced himself not to look back at the strange old woman who followed them down the street. He didn't want to get creeped out or submit to his instinct to run, but she followed with an intensity that unsettled him like nothing else. What are we going to do? We can't lose her. Zack wasn't much of a telepath. He was told he was barely a 2, but it was enough to be able to communicate with Barna, or any other telepath in range. I'm not sure, rumbled Barna's deep voice in his head. You're not sure? Zack balked. Aren't you supposed to be XA0? Can't you fly a helicopter and take out people in the blink of an eye like some action hero? Next to him, Barna chuckled out loud. Movies aren't real life, kid. You should know that. But no, it's not lacking in skill, but information. I can't sense what she's thinking or feeling, but she doesn't seem to have any psychic shielding. It's like she doesn't exist. I've never come across anything like this before. She could just be a madwoman, but she could also be a highly trained assassin. I prefer to know what we're facing before we escalate this to combat. Zack snorted. What do you expect? Turn around and talking to her? Actually, yes. Barna stopped walking. Oh, great! Sighing, Zack turned around as well. The woman walked towards them at the same pace as she had been for the last half hour. She was an odd collection of things. Her hair was pure white and dark-faced, wrinkled as if she was very old, but the bright-coloured clothes she wore were young. More than that, it was as if someone had put an old woman's head on a young woman's body. It was creepy. As she neared them, Zack looked into her dark eyes. All he saw inside was static. It flowed out of her and towards him like a tsunami of icy water. A wave of black static hit him, and he flinched back, stumbling from the force of it. He heard a terrible rushing in his ears. Barna seemed to grab him, and something snapped in his head. The world stopped flowing and rushing, and an old woman stood in front of them. Zack blinked up at the considerably taller figure. A thin, heavily lined Ronin face stared back down at him. Her black eyes seemed hollow, but then she smiled, filling the empty chasm in her eyes with a caramel flame. The static pulsed gently around her. Strange or not, Zack sensed at that moment that she meant them no harm. Relaxing, he smiled awkwardly back at her. Hi? Whirly man and fire dancer must listen to old Anna, she said in a lilting, childlike voice. Leave little lamb to the wolves. Protect each other, or die yourselves. She nodded as if to accent a wholly logical point she was making. Or die yourselves. She walked past them, and Zack watched the woman shuffle back into the nighttime shadows. He stared after her, his mouth slightly open in his surprise. There was silence between he and Barna for a good minute. A broad hand touched Zack's back. What was that all about? I don't know, he shrugged. She was a time-saver, though. Really powerful. But mad, right? Barna smirked. Mad like Necro? Zack laughed, releasing the odd tension in him. Probably. Scene break. It was pitch black and freezing cold by the time he and Barna got back to the old cottage. It was surrounded in overgrown brush and in an abandoned part of town, but less than 5 minutes' walk to the private airstrip where the rebel-controlled jet sat refuelling in a hangar. The cottage itself was relatively intact, although from the outside it looked about ready to crumble away into a broken pile of flat slate rocks. It seemed oddly welcoming to Zack as they walked up the steps and across the balcony. He opened the front door, and the much warmer air brushed his face like a welcome hug. Inside, light flickered from the fire on the right side of the room, illuminating a small space with a comforting glow. Nama and Talon sat to his left on one of the bunk beds, and Usher was crouched down, tending to the fire in the old hearth. Lalane sat at a table in the middle of the room, facing the door. One of her massive handguns sat at her place setting, barrel also facing the door, as if she were guarding the house. She looked up at them with those big black eyes of hers, and Zack tried not to show his discomfort under her powerful gaze. Asha stood. "What happened?" "Harmless," answered Barnard as he closed the door and walked around Zack. The older man picked up a loaf of muck from the table, ripped off a chunk of it, and threw it behind him to Zack. He caught it and took a bite, realizing only then he was ravenous. "Yeah, time say, lady," he said, with food in his mouth. "If she's still remotely connected to reality, we might be facing trouble with the RA." "We already know the trouble's coming." Varna leaned over a chair. "Yes," agreed Asha. "It was too easy. Trade negotiations don't even go that smooth between rebel cells." Zack pulled a rough wooden chair out from the table and sat down. "So what should we do?" "What do you think, Leland?" Asha glanced sideways. "You're the expert with the RA. What should we do?" Leland grabbed the remains of the loaf from Bana. "Mena will kill every last one of us to get what he wants. He may even kill us before the deal if he finds out that I'm the one helping you." "What kind of ex-family are they, then?" Zack gasped. She shrugged. "Mena is a zealot. To him, a deserter is just as bad as a traitor. Personally, I'd vote to get the Nuthen out of here. But if you want to keep on, I'd suggest being very careful and smart." "Well," Nama stood up and approached the table, leaning on the back of an empty chair. "Do you have any ideas on how to do that?" "Yes," she said, biting into the food. "It's just like a game of strategy, except the Lord piece is the explosives you want, and their lady piece is Mena. It's all about being smarter than they are, and Mena is very smart. But he does have weaknesses we can use. For example, he will not move if his little brother Goyd is under threat." Scene 21. Approximately 9 a.m. the next day. Goyd sighed and crossed his arms over his chest. The intersection in front of the Milan Family Bank was crowded with people. A set of marble steps guided clients to the broad entrance, and great white columns lifted the roof far above everyone's heads. It was the oldest bank in Carmel, probably one of the oldest in all of Rona, and had been in their family for many generations. Most people thought rather highly of the building, but Goyd disliked it. It always seemed to him to be such a pompous establishment, with pretentious employees who were always looking down their noses at people, simply because they had the money. Goyd stood on the street opposite the old bank, the others situated at various points around the intersection, waiting. The target was an Iranian businessman. He was a mid-level manager for the Megacorp conglomerate, which was the most powerful corporation in the Five Nations. In Goyd's not-so-humble opinion, the MCC were even more pretentious than this family bank. At the top of the stairs, their target emerged. The man was young, perhaps barely in his 20s. He wore an expensive grey suit and blue striped tie. He was one of the lucky ones to be born a Norm. Without any psi or talent abilities, he was free to live the life he wanted. Walking next to the suit was a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. She was tiny, about the size of a Ronin toddler. A mop of wavy dark red hair covered her little head and shoulders like cotton wool. Goyd frowned. He hadn't known the suit had a child with him. He watched the Iranian take his daughter's hand as they started to cross the road. The girl reminded Goyd of his own children, all killed by the guard. He sighed. From a Mena's point of view, taking the child as well as her father would be a strategic advantage. Goyd knew, however, what that would mean for the life of that little girl. He felt a stab of guilty dread. Reaching into his long woolen jacket, he took a quick swig from his hip flask. A trail of liquid cut its way through his mouth and down into his stomach, burning away the guilt and dread. He put the flask back into the jacket and signalled with one waved hand for the others to get into position. The intersection was very wide and crowded with people. It wasn't hard for his group to dodge around pedestrians and surround the lone Iranian man and child. When the others were in position around him, Goyd stepped in close behind. He lifted his weapon and touched the back of the man's suit jacket with the barrel. The young man seemed like the kind of person who had probably never seen a gun before, but he still stiffened at the touch of it and stopped walking. Without saying a word, Goyd took his elbow and guided him towards a waiting taxi, one of the few still loyal to the RA. Scene break. Mena stared down at the unconscious Iranian man, who lay on the floor of their old servant quarters. He had an oddly contented expression on his young white face, and looked rather like a boy in his father's dishevelled suit, a boy pretending to be a businessman. Hate seethed in Mena, and his eyes narrowed. This boy didn't even deserve to be in his servants' quarters. He was worse than these rebels. He was a norm, only one step away from being guard. He was practically a dog, and his little whelp too. Mena wondered how the dog would sleep at such a time, and brushed his mind with a telepathic hand. Inside the simple, innocent mind were mental blocks and checks, carefully constructed to keep him asleep until the right mental trigger would wake him. Goyd must have forced the dog to sleep. Mena sensed his little brother walking towards him down the hall and turned around. "Why did you knock him out?" There was alcohol on Goyd's breath as he approached him. "Blubbing like a baby. Wouldn't shut up. Thought if he was bruised he'd draw too much attention in Arana. So I did the next best thing." Mena nodded. "Smart. And the brat?" "Playroom with Joe. Gave her some of Rena's old toys. Happy as a lark." "Good. Those rebels will be here soon. Make sure everything's ready." His brother looked a little uncertain. "You sure we should let them so close to the explosives? We could use a decoy." "No." Mena shook his head. "They might be smarter than they look. A decoy could be dangerous." "But just do as I say," Mena barked. He closed his mouth and sighed. "Yes, sir." Mena watched his little brother walk back the way he'd come. As he went, Goyd pulled out their father's old silver hip flask from a jacket pocket and took a quick gulp of its contents. Mena's eyes narrowed. Since Goyd's last child was killed by the guard, he'd started to drink far too much and have bouts of uncontrolled violent behaviour, a real problem given his kinetic ability. It could serve as a dangerous distraction. "Goyd, give me this flask." His brother turned around, frowning at him. "It's just a little whiskey. Can't a guy—" "No," Mena said firmly. "You're drinking too much and it's getting dangerous. Give me the flask and stay sober from now on. I'll give it back to you when you return." His brother sighed again and took it out of his back pocket. Mena grabbed the flask. As his hand brushed Goyd's, he sensed frustration and humiliation. Mena didn't pull rank with him often anymore because it was insulting to Goyd's self-respect. However, RA business sense had to come first over their personal issues. Sober, Goyd was much better able to handle himself. He'd need his wits to keep the dog in check, while watching for betrayal from the rebels. He would also need to kill the traitor if the dog couldn't do it for them. Besides, by Mena's logic, he could always apologize later when Goyd returned. But if Goyd was killed because he was drunk, an apology would be useless. Scene 22. Nama slowed the car to a stop at a vast 8-lane intersection. He sighed. He didn't like this, not one bit. Everyone knew the story of the RA, how 3 years ago a traitor in their midst made a deal with the agency and his government for immunity and nearly wiped out the RA. After that, they started attacking not only government buildings, but schools. The Rona Aban became killers of children. It was horrific. He didn't understand why they couldn't get these explosives in some other way. He honestly would have rather tried to attack the armed forces than the Rona Aban, despite the risks. At least the armed forces had honour and rules of engagement. Not so with the RA. The lights changed and he shifted the enormous car into first gear. Carmel was a huge city, the largest in all of the 5 nations. Most of the buildings were massive and made of some kind of strange creamy yellow stone from a quarry in the southern mountains. The streets were filled with giants that towered over him. Everything, the cars, furniture, and especially the buildings, were oversized. They made him feel like a child in an adult world. He knew the feeling was simply culture shock, but combined with the imminent danger posed by these revenge-obsessed RA, he felt rather unsettled and scattered. He sighed again. "Talon?" Asha sat next to Nama in the front passenger seat. I'll need you to stay in the car while we make this transfer. In the back, Taylor snorted. No argument from me. Nama, I need you to be my gun hand. He nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Asha had been tense and distant for the whole mission, and while Nama was sure he wasn't the only one to notice, he trusted she would do her best to keep them safe. They turned into the street where the RA's broken manor house slouched in the centre of some large overgrown gardens. Nama pulled the rental car into the gravelled driveway. At the end, the high metal gates were open wide. He steered the overly broad car in through the gap and parked it in front of the entrance. A number of armed Ronin were stationed outside, all watching them warily. Nama counted 7, but none of them seemed to be the Milan brothers. Asha got out of the car first. Nama left the keys in the ignition and got out as well. Bana and young Zack stepped in behind them, and as the 4 of them turned, the front door of the manor opened. "Ah, you're here," said Mena in such a convivial tone of voice that Nama imagined they were being greeted for a grand dinner party and not an armed trading of resources. "Welcome, I am Mena." He approached Asha, and Nama had to forcibly suppress the sudden urge to put a weapon in the old man's face. Asha, mirroring the man's friendliness, took Mena's offered hand. "I am Asha. Thank you for accepting this trade agreement. Hawk sends his thanks and regards." Mena's eyes widened and he seemed genuinely surprised. "You know Hawk?" "Yes, I am his representative. Are your people ready?" "Of course." The older Ronin turned and his younger brother came out of the doorway. He carried someone over his shoulder. The figure was obviously unconscious, but too small to be a full-grown Ronin. "Unfortunately," Mena continued in an almost bored tone, "our second man had far too much to drink last night." He sighed. "He's a little worse for wear, I'm afraid." "Will he be all right for this mission?" Asha asked. "He'll do what's necessary when the time comes." There was a snippet of danger in the older man's voice, and Nama fought to control his unsettled fear. Something else was going on, and whatever it wasn't good. Asha lifted an unimpressed eyebrow at the man. Turning, she addressed the younger Milan and pointed at the vehicle behind them. "Please, take a seat in the car. We won't be a moment." The younger Milan brother passed them, likely to get in the car, but Nama didn't see because he continued to watch the old man warily. With every bone and instinct, Nama did not like Mena Milan. Once the car door slammed, Mena bowed his head formally, somehow pulling off the perfect humble bow, but at the same time still having an air of condescension in every movement. "Would you all like to come in and see the explosives?" "Yes, thank you, I will come in, but my people will stay here." Asha glanced sideways at Nama. Before he could verbalize any objection, she spoke with a gruff voice. "Stay here." "But," he said telepathically, "no, Mena's brother is in our car, so they will not kill me, but they may kill Talon if he's left alone." Sighing, he bowed his head. "Yes, ma'am." Nama turned around, collected the other 2 men with a firm glance, and walked them back towards the car. Asha had already gone inside by the time he turned around again. He sighed and touched the minds of the other 3 rebels, including Talon, so they could all communicate without being overheard. What is Asha doing, going in there by herself? Inside the car, Talon was not happy. "Protecting us," Nama reminded his friend. "They won't hurt her because we have Mena's brother." "But she shouldn't." "I don't like it any more than you, Tay, but she's the boss." Bana's voice was deep and calm in his mind. "She knows what she's doing, Talon. She'll be fine." "What he said," interjected Zack. "It's Bana and I going in there you've got to worry about." Nama grunted and looked sideways at the young man. "With your dodging and Bana's training, you two just have to keep your guard up and you'll be fine." Zack lifted a dark eyebrow at him. "You sure?" "Kid, you can dodge a bullet from at point-blank range. I have no doubt you'll be just fine." Unseen behind Zack, Bana frowned at him. Being an empath, he would have sensed the niggling fear and doubt in him. But his lie was meant for Zack to keep him focused, not for anyone else. The boy was good with combat missions and was developing into a very effective combatant rebel, but he did at times psych himself out with his own doubts, so he often needed a pep talk to get him focused. Knowing this about the boy, Nama was unapologetic about lying because it would keep Zack alive. Nama watched the front door and the scattered RA members who stood around them and the car. The RA were all silent and unemotional. They guarded the entrance of the manor house without any apparent anxiety, as if the four rebels were of no importance whatsoever. Despite their disinterest, they still outnumbered them and could easily kill the four men if things came to blows. He waited tensely for Asha to return. Lalan had given Asha a small crude handheld testing device to authenticate that the RA did in fact have explosives. When she came outside again, Asha lifted the device so that they could see the bright orange strip on its faceplate. Orange confirmed that there were definitely explosives present, though it couldn't discern the type. On the top step, Asha smiled at Mena and shook his hand. I believe we can proceed. She glanced back at them in the car. Zack, Bana, come on up. The two men moved from beside Nama towards the house entrance. They would stay with the RA until Goyd and this other person returned from Marana. Nama didn't like it, but again, he wasn't the boss. He just hoped his ill-ease was nothing more than his own culture shock and paranoia.